Chapter 4, 1999. The sub-level monitoring station was practically useless. Every screen was either flickering or dead, making it practically impossible to get reliable readings on the reactor core and cooling systems. Sandra kept one eye on her team, who were trying unsuccessfully to bring the equipment back online, as she worked the walkie-talkie.
It's shaking hard down here. Joe, do you copy?
Yamato stepped away from the uncooperative screen. "We've lost the monitors," he reported. He was sweating visibly behind the visor of his helmet. "Sensors are down," another technician confirmed. The team turned toward Sandra, waiting for her to make the call. She hesitated, knowing how much Joe was counting on her to get him the data he needed, but it looked like that wasn't going to happen. The escalating tremors and blackouts had thrown a monkey wrench in their plans and forced her to put the safety of her crew ahead of her mission. This was no place you wanted to be during an earthquake, or whatever this was.
"We're turning back,"
she declared.
"Let's go."
Yet another tremor shook the control room, nearly throwing Joe off balance. He grabbed onto the table to steady himself. Overhead light fixtures swayed violently, even as the fluorescent bulbs went dead. All the electronics crashed again, while dust was shaken loose from the ceiling. The discarded coffee cup vibrated towards the edge of the table. Joe lunged for the mug, hoping to rescue it in time, but he was too late. It crashed to the floor and shattered. So much for number one dad. The tremor subsided and the lights blinked back on. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the next shock, before frantically trying to resume the shutdown procedure, if it wasn't too late already. No one, least of all Joe, knew when the next tremor would hit, or how big it might be.
"Joe, are you there?"
Sandra's voice broke through the static.
"We're heading back through the containment seal."
He clutched the walkie-talkie to his ear. Hurry, he thought. Please hurry. Sandra and the others raced back the way they'd come, moving as fast as they could in the heavy radiation suits. She prayed that was fast enough. "You need to get out of there," Joe urged via the walkie-talkie. "If there's a reactor breach, you won't last 5 minutes, suits or no suits." She could hear the fear in his voice even through the static. "Do you hear me?"
"I hear you,"
she responded, breathing hard.
"We're coming."
A sonic pulse cut her off, thrumming louder than before. The floor quaked beneath her feet, causing her to miss a step. She threw out a hand to brace herself against a wall, and could feel the vibration even through her insulated gloves. The lights flickered and a massive jolt rocked the building to its foundations, as though it had been struck by a titanic sledgehammer. In the control room, Joe and the others were thrown to the floor. The exterior window shattered, spraying broken fragments onto the floor, while a glass partition cracked down the middle. A file cabinet toppled over, spilling old paperwork over the floor tile. Empty desk chairs bounced and rolled about. Sprawled on the floor, not far from the broken coffee mug, Joe rode out the tremor, keeping his face covered. Not until the shaking stopped did he cautiously lift his head to look around. Checking to make sure his glasses were still in one piece, he painfully peeled himself off the floor. His nerves were jangled, and he was bruised from the fall, but he was relieved to see that the control room was more or less intact. His eyes sought out the master control monitors, which, miraculously, were still running. Stan, Takashi, and the others began to clamber to their feet as well. Nobody seemed seriously injured, at least not here in the control room. But what about Sandra and her team? He peered up at a video monitor. Closed-circuit TV footage showed a crew in full radiation suits dashing through the reactor unit sublevels. He didn't need to make out Sandra's face to know who was leading the team. He pointed anxiously at the screen. "Sandra and her crew," he exclaimed. "They're in the contaminant area." Takashi looked aghast. "Why?" Joe didn't have time to explain. "Oh shit," he muttered. What had that last shock done to the reactor? He dashed for the exit, shouting back over his shoulder at Takashi. "Put the safety doors on manual override!" "I can't do that!" the deputy engineer protested. Joe didn't want to hear it. He shouted back from the doorway. "Put the doors on manual!" Sandra and the others raced down a concrete corridor, which felt twice as long as she remembered. A stairway leading to an upper level finally appeared before them. Thank God, she thought. Maybe we could still get out of here and, Another jolt nearly threw her off her feet. Yamato stumbled, but she grabbed onto him and kept him from falling. The cumbersome radiation suits made every movement clumsier than it ought to be, and they were unbearably hot as well. She was half tempted to shuck the suit, but that would be insane. For all she knew, there could be a leak at any minute. The team squeezed into the cramped, dimly lit stairwell. They were all panting now, weighed down by the heavy suits and breathing gear. Sandra's muscles ached and her legs felt like they were made of lead, but adrenaline and panic kept her and the others climbing for their lives. If they could just make it past the contaminant threshold. An emergency stairwell led them from the control room to the primary reactor unit. Joe rushed down, taking the steps 2 or 3 at a time. His heart pounded in his chest, going a mile a minute, while he prayed that Sandra was heading towards him from the opposite direction. He wasn't sure how much longer he could count on Takashi to keep the contaminant doors open. "Don't stop," he silently pleaded with her. "Don't slow down for a second. Please." Reaching level 5 in record time, he burst up the stairwell and skidded to a stop right before the entrance to the contaminant area. A large button, surrounded by emergency instructions in both Japanese and English, was installed in the wall to one side of the entrance. Joe peered down the long corridor beyond, hoping desperately to see Sandra and the others running toward him. But the hallway was eerily silent and empty, as though it had already been evacuated. He was tempted to run into the corridor to find Sandra, but there was no time to suit up and somebody had to stand by to trigger the manual controls, just in case the worst-case scenario played out, which was looking more and more likely by the moment. "Come on, Sandy," he thought. "Where the hell are you?" A closed-circuit video camera was mounted in a corner where the walls met the ceiling. Joe hoped to God that Takashi was still watching this. He shouted up at the camera. "Takashi, tell me this door is on manual!" The other man's voice emerged from the comm system.
"Manual, yes, but Joe, we're starting to breach. You understand me?"
He understood all right. This was the nightmare that every nuclear engineer dreaded, the one that kept them up at nights, thinking about Chernobyl and the 3 Mile Island. He feared there was nothing he could do to save one or all of the reactors. But maybe he could still save his wife. "I'm right here," he told Takashi, as forcefully as he could. "As soon as they're through, I'll seal it." He hoped that would be enough to keep Takashi's finger off the panic button, but he wouldn't blame the other man for playing it safe. Takashi didn't have the love of his life still in the danger zone. "Sandra," he said into the walkie-talkie. "Can you hear me?" "I'm here, honey. I'm at the door." She held on tightly to the walkie-talkie as she and the others sprinted breathlessly down yet another seemingly endless corridor. Steel-toed rubber boots pounded against the hard concrete floors. The crew had made it up the stairs, but they still had ways to go before they were beyond the contaminant area. Joe's voice, coming over the walkie-talkie, urged her on, even though his words were fragmented by harsh blasts of static.
"They're waiting for you at the checkpoint. They're waiting."
Emergency klaxons started blaring behind them like angry foghorns. Flashing red annunciator lights turned the sterile white corridors incarnadine. Sandra glanced back behind her, as did the rest of her team. Panic gripped her heart. They all knew what the sirens and the flashing lights meant, and why the klaxons were getting louder and closer by the moment. The danger posed by the tremors was no longer just a terrifying possibility. The fiery genie inside the reactor had escaped its bottle and was chasing after them. They were going to die, unless they made it to safety in time. Takashi was alone in the control room. The rest of the staff had already deserted the premises, including Hayato. The older man had volunteered to stay behind, but Takashi had convinced him to take charge of the evacuation instead. Hayato was a family man, with a wife, children, and several grandchildren who needed him, while Takashi had put his career ahead of any serious relationship so far. The young engineer stared in horror at the hallway schematic of the lower levels. Blinking red icons indicated the rapid spread of radiation throughout the corridors. His eyes widened in dread as he stayed at his post, torn between his duty to contain the disaster and his purely human concern for his friends and co-workers. He could only imagine how excruciating this must be for Joe Brody, even as Takashi worried whether the American engineer would really be able to do what was necessary, no matter the cost. Takashi wasn't sure he could, not if it was his true love at stake. Joe stared anxiously past the threshold, frozen in fear. He listened numbly to Takashi's fractured voice over the intercom. Static interference mangled the transmission, rendering it barely comprehensible.
Brody, we are at the beach.
"What?" Joe asked, straining to make out what was being said. "Say again."
Catastrophic radiation breach.
Joe thought he couldn't be any more scared, but this nightmare just kept getting worse and worse. Utter horror transfixed him. This couldn't be happening.
Seal the corridor,
Takashi pleaded.
or the whole city will be exposed.
"Keep going," Sandra thought. "Just a little farther." Terror overcame exhaustion as she and her crew sprinted down a corridor, despite the best efforts of the earthquake to slow them down. An earth-shaking rumble caused the floor to quake beneath their feet, tossing them from one side to another. Yamamoto tumbled headfirst into the concrete floor, forcing Sandra to turn back and help him to his feet. His visor had survived the fall intact, thank goodness, and they were about to resume their flight when the air rippled behind them as a billowing cloud of radioactive vapor blew in from the far end of the corridor. The oncoming vapor set off the radiation sensors in the ceiling, causing the emergency klaxons to sound directly overhead. Flashing red lights accompanied the sirens. The hot gases and steam rushed towards Sandra and the others with frightening speed. Unable to outrun it, her eyes wide with horror, she braced herself as the cloud blasted past them like a red-hot gust of wind, knocking them all to the floor. Buffeted by the blast, she felt the heat of the vapors through the multiple layers of her protective suit. She held her breath instinctively, despite the gas mask protecting her air supply. "Oh my God," she thought. "Have I been exposed?" But that wasn't the worst part. The cloud kept on going, triggering sirens further ahead. It flooded down the corridor toward the contaminant threshold. Sandra and Yamato traded stunned looks. They all knew what would happen if the irradiated cloud reached the checkpoint first. What would have to happen for the safety of the entire community. They needed to be on the other side of that boundary before it was too late. Panicked, they all scrambled to their feet and ran madly for the checkpoint.
5 seconds. 4 seconds.
Takashi counted down over the intercom as Joe stood like a statue right outside the contaminated area, staring bleakly at the empty corridor beyond. He remembered kissing Sandra in the car less than an hour ago. He tried to remember the last thing he had said to her before they went their separate ways this morning. Had he said he loved her, or even said goodbye? He knew he couldn't wait much longer.
Joe,
Takashi said, reaching the end of his countdown. No doubt he was tracking the progress of the radiation leak as it spread through the lower levels.
you have to shut it down. Now.
Looking away from the entrance, Joe stared at the manual control button on the wall. He tried to step toward it, but his feet didn't want to move. He forced himself to take one step toward the button. 2, 3, until the button was within reach. He raised his hand, clenched his fist. God forgive me, he thought. Static squawked from the walkie-talkie. Fragmented bursts of his wife's voice came over the speaker.
Joe, can you hear me?
His heart surged in his chest. He clutched the walkie-talkie hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Desperation filled his voice. Sandra? Perversely, the static abated long enough for him to hear her clearly at last, perhaps for the last time.
Joe, it's too late. We're not gonna make it.
Her words hit him harder than any earthquake, shattering his world. No, no, he shouted into the walkie-talkie. Don't you say that, don't you stop!
You have to do it.
The signal began to break up again, pops and crackles threatening to consume her final words.
You have to live. For Ford.
The radio sputtered and died. He smacked it furiously, trying to get her back. Sandra! Klaxons blared as a swirling cloud of discharged vapor came gushing around a bend at the far end of the corridor. Red lights flashed in alarm. The radioactive gases rushed towards Joe and the boundary.
You have to seal it!
Takashi shouted frantically over the intercom.
Joe!
Joe thought of the unsuspecting city outside the plant. Horde would be at school now, maybe playing at recess, along with dozens of other kids, and thousands of other men, women, and children were going about their business, unaware of the hell that had been unleashed from the damaged reactor, the hell that was trapped in now. I'm sorry, Sandy. Screaming in rage, he drew back his arm and pounded his fist into the emergency control button. A transparent barrier, more than 6 inches thick, instantly slammed down like the blade of a guillotine, sealing off the contaminated corridor. The advancing red lights halted right on the other side of the barrier. The screaming sirens faded away, echoing into silence. Dear God, Joe thought. What have I done? Alone in the control room, Takashi sagged in relief, sinking into his seat as he watched the blinking red icons tail off at the checkpoint. A message flashed upon the screen. Barrier secure. Takashi kept looking at the message, almost afraid to believe it was true. He felt like he had aged 20 years in the last few minutes. They had come so close to a total catastrophe. If Joe had been just a few seconds slower.
Radiation is contained,
He reported over the comm. He paused before asking the question he was afraid to ask.
Is Sandra with you, Joe?
Joe couldn't answer. He felt destroyed by what he had just done. The finality of shutting the barrier on his wife. The walkie-talkie slipped from his fingers, crashing unnoticed onto the floor. Unable to stand, he slid limply to the ground. His back against the thick plexiglass barrier, he buried his face in his hands.
Joe?
Takashi continued to talk to him.
The barrier will only hold so long. We have to close the lead shield too.
Joe knew he was right, but he couldn't cope with that right now. He needed a moment, just to try to come to grips with what he had lost, with what his life had just become. He and Sandra had been together since college, even gone into the same industry together. He had always assumed they would grow old together, watching Ford grow up. A dull pounding reached his ears, coming from the barrier behind him. Dread gripped his heart as he realized what the pounding meant. "Oh God," he thought. "I'm not sure I could stand this." He didn't want to turn around, but of course he had no choice. Lifting his face from his hands, he forced himself to turn slowly toward the barrier and the ghastly sight waiting for him on the other side of the transparent wall. Maybe this was his punishment for failing Sandra and the others. He needed to come face to face with what he had done. Toyokai Yamato was there, pressed up frantically against the barrier, pounding with both hands against the unyielding plexiglass. Behind his visor, his face was a portrait of sheer, unadulterated panic. Joe couldn't hear Yamato's screams through the soundproof wall, but that wasn't necessary. The fear and desperation in the man's eyes spoke loud enough. The doomed technician was begging for his life, even though he was already as good as dead. "I'm sorry," Joe thought. "It's too late. There's nothing I can do." Part of him envied Yamato. At least his suffering would be over soon. He wouldn't have to live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. He wouldn't have to tell his son that he would never see his mother again. For a moment Joe was relieved that it wasn't Sandra pounding on the barrier, and felt ashamed for his cowardice. But then the rest of the work crew rounded the corner, catching up with Yamato. The other men threw themselves against the barrier as well, blind animal fear overcoming their reason. Their frenzied faces shrieked behind their masks. Their fists pounded relentlessly at the impenetrable wall between death and survival. But Sandra didn't try to break through. Instead, she merely slumped in exhaustion on the other side of the wall. Anguished eyes sought out Joe's, and they stared at each other hopelessly. Only inches of solid plexiglass divided them, but it might as well have been a continent. Joe tried to speak, to push the words past his throat, but they wouldn't come. His throat tightened. His eyes burned with tears that had yet to spill down his face. He couldn't imagine how they had possibly come to this unthinkable moment. It wasn't fair.
"Joe,"
Takashi interrupted.
"I'm closing the shield."
No, Joe thought. Not yet. He looked around frantically for the fallen walkie-talkie and snatched it from the floor. Tears began to fall as he held it to his lips. "Sandra, can you hear me?" There was so much he needed to say, so much he had to apologize for. But only static answered his agonized calls. She shook her head sadly, holding his gaze with her eyes. I'm sorry. He sobbed. She couldn't hear him, but she didn't need to. His pain and anguish and guilt were written all over his face. The fear faded from her eyes as a strange calm appeared to settle over her. He could tell she knew what he did, what he had to do, and what it had cost them both. She placed her palm against the glass. He reached out to place his own hand over hers, only to hear a jarring buzzer inform him that their time was up. The second barrier engaged. 2 solid lead doors slid in from both sides of the doorway. Joe yanked his hand back just in time. For a few final moments, their eyes met in silent communion. Her lips moved, as though she was trying to comfort him, or perhaps just to say goodbye. But he would never know what her last words were. The doors slammed shut, cutting her off from view. Forever. Goodbye, Joe thought. A violent tremor jolted him from his grief. The building quaked all around him. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. The floor bucked beneath him.
The entire plant is collapsing.
Takashi shouted from the comm.
We have to get out. Now!
Joe placed his hand on the lead door, exactly where he knew Sandra's face must be. It tore him apart to know that she was still there, still alive, less than a foot away, entombed inside a radioactive death trap, facing the end without even her family beside her in her final moments. And it killed him to know now that he had to leave her. You have to live, she had said. For Ford. Joe knew she was right. If not for their son, he would have gladly stayed behind to perish with Sandra. At least they'd be together, even if a wall of lead separated them. But he had to think about Ford now. The boy couldn't lose his mother and his father. He owed it to Sandra to make it out of this alive. For Ford's sake. Tearing himself away from the lead door as he scrambled to his feet and ran for his life. The control room was empty now. Not even Takashi remained to bear witness to the plant's final moments of operation. Unattended monitors captured real-time video surveillance of the last wave of plant personnel fleeing the complex. Joe could be glimpsed in one monitor, barely making it out to the parking lot in time, along with Takashi. Squealing cars and trucks sped out of the gates, trying to put as much distance as possible between them and the plant. Power lines snapped and whipped about, spitting showers of sparks. The sky-high transmission towers in the switchyard tottered. Another screen watched over Reactor Room 1, deep in the heart of the abandoned plant. The 500-ton pressure vessel containing the reactor core was shielded by dense layers of steel and concrete, but hot gases continued to leak from the ruptured casing. Silence reigned over the compromised chamber until the massive vessel suddenly toppled over, crashing into the reinforced concrete floor as something huge and inconceivable burst up through the floor. A violent discharge of radiation wreaked havoc with the transmission so that the screen caught only a fleeting glimpse of the large, blurry object that vaguely resembled a claw. Then an immense pulse of energy, indiscriminately powerful, swept through the entire plant, disrupting every electronic circuit, knocking out all the lights. The screens in the control room went black. The Genjira International School was a one-story building boasting traditional Japanese architecture, complete with bamboo shutters on the windows. Sitting in class with his fellow students, facing the blackboard, Ford found it hard to concentrate on Miss Odaka's language lesson. He couldn't wait for the day to be over so his dad could finally see the surprise that he and Mom had prepared for him. Ford was also hoping for some chocolate cake and ice cream. His mouth watered in anticipation. Emergency sirens started wailing outside, distracting Ford from his sugary daydreams. The sirens sounded like they were coming from only a few miles away. Frowning, Miss Odaka turned away from the chalkboard. "All right, children," she said in Japanese. "Let's practice our safety drills." Ford figured it was just another duck and cover drill as well, until the fearsome metallic groaning penetrated the thin walls of the classroom. Both teachers and students stopped what they were doing and turned their heads towards the window, where the nuclear power plant could be glimpsed not far away. Ford instantly thought of his parents, and how stressed his dad had been that morning. Did this have something to do with the problem at the plant? He rushed to the window even as Miss Odaka tried to herd the rest of the class out the door. Boys and girls in matching blue uniforms poured out of the school, onto the grassy lawn outside, even as the ominous rumbling grew louder and louder. His teacher called to him, but Ford barely registered her anxious voice. Unable to look away, he stared out the window as the entire plant collapsed before his eyes. With a deafening roar, all three contaminant buildings dropped out of sight, as though suddenly swallowed up by the earth. Billowing clouds of dirt and debris rose up where the towers had once stood. Children and even a few teachers screamed as, in a matter of minutes, the looming nuclear power plant ceased to exist. "Mom!" Ford thought, all thought of cake and birthdays forgotten. "Dad!" The roar of the disaster consumed his entire world.